Hi, I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. There are more immigrants in Canada than ever before. New census numbers from this week show that immigrants make up nearly a quarter of the country's population. But the process of getting here and settling in isn't always easy.
There are settlement agencies across the country who get funding from the federal government, from the provincial government, and other sources. But we haven't seen the support for them keep pace with the dramatic increase in how many immigrants are arriving here.
Dakshana Bascaramurty is the Globe's race and ethnicity reporter. And as someone who's been covering immigration for over a decade, she'll tell us about the people behind the census numbers and about one Indian family who died in Canada trying to cross to the United States. This is the Decibel. Dakshana, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So this week's census information showed that Canada's immigrant population grew to 23%. What else did we actually learn, though, from the latest census data about who is immigrating to Canada and how?
So the trend for so much of Canada's history had been that the bulk of immigrants were coming from Europe. But basically, since the 1980s, we have seen a dramatic shift. And now the majority of immigrants are coming from Asian countries. And the top three source countries for immigrants are India, the Philippines, and China. Another interesting thing that we learned from the census release is that almost 1/3 of all children in Canada have one parent born abroad. You know, I'm not just talking about the immigrant population. This is all Canadians. And so that makes up, 1.9 million children younger than 15. So, these are called second generation kids. And I think it's really going to shape, what the future of Canada looks like.
Okay. And you mentioned that India is the top country for people coming to Canada. And I know you've done a lot of reporting on this process, Dakshana, and the industry in particular that's been created in India to make this happen. How would you describe what you learned about the pull, I guess, that people from India feel that motivates them to come to Canada?
Canada is seen as this land of opportunity. A lot of families will start saving when their children are very young to, sponsor this move across the ocean to Canada. And there is a growing middle class in India that's now making it more possible to make this move. But there's still a lot of people who are going into debt, who are, mortgaging their homes or the farmland that they own to make this possible because they think that it's going to pay off in the long term. They get their one child started off in Canada, maybe enrolled in a university or a college there. And then eventually they'll get the job that earns them enough money to bring other members of the family over. So I've reported a lot on the way that international education is being used as a means of getting to Canada and then, working and applying for permanent residency. But we saw in the census data that there are also a huge number of Indian immigrants who are coming here as skilled workers, who are coming here through the provincial nominee program. And, they now make up 18.6% of immigrants to Canada.
And I know you've done a lot of reporting specifically about one family who came here from India. This is a bit of a sad story, but can you just tell me a little bit about the Patel family and what happened to them?
Sure. I spent a good chunk of this year working with a reporter, freelancer, Akanksha Singh in India, telling the story of this family. So as you mentioned, this is a pretty tragic tale. There's a family of four in the town of Dingucha in the western state of Gujarat in India. It was the father, Jagdish Patel, the mother, Vaishali Patel, and they had two kids, Vihangi, who was 11, and Dharmik, who was 3. And there is a huge Gujarati population in the U.S., and the idea is you go to where you already have an established community. So as far as we understand, they wanted to make this move to the U.S., but it's difficult, much more difficult to immigrate to the U.S. than it is to immigrate to Canada. So what we understand happened is they flew to Canada and then tried to make this very dangerous, undocumented trek across the border to the U.S. and were unsuccessful. Their bodies were found frozen in the snow in early January, and they were just short of crossing the border from Canada into the U.S. They were found in Manitoba. And basically this sparked so much coverage in India of this huge machine, this smuggling network that spans India, Canada, and the U.S. of getting people who are undocumented into the U.S. through Canada. And I remember when the story broke in early January, this seemed like such a surprising route for people to take. But I learned through my reporting that it's not that unusual. On average, from 2010 to 2020, 168 people each year from India are apprehended by U.S. border officials trying to cross from Canada to the U.S. At these sort of illegal border crossings.
So this is not necessarily a unique trek to take then. Like, what would be the landscape that they're trying to cross at that border?
So this was rural Manitoba in January in the middle of a blizzard. And, this was a family that had always lived in India. Akanksha traveled to this village and she spoke to some of their neighbors, and she heard that Vaishali, the mother, was the kind of parent who would call her kids in if there was just a little chill in the air, because she thought that, they weren't safe out there, that they might get sick. And, this was a major blizzard in Manitoba. They weren't dressed appropriately for it, and they were, on foot, for hours trying to get across the border. So these were extreme conditions, even for people, who were Canadian born, who had grown up in that environment. I don't think they would ever attempt such a trek.
And with 2 little kids, too.
And with 2 little kids. And, the same day that they were found, there were 7 other undocumented Indian nationals who were also found around the border. There was an American, Steve Shand, who was driving a van, and there were 2 undocumented Indian nationals who were with him. And it's presumed that he was driving with those 2. He was going to pick up the 5, and also possibly the Patel family, who got separated from the group.
Wow. I mean, this is just a devastatingly sad story, Dakshana, to hear the details of this. You talked about this guy, though, Steve Shand, who sounds like he was part of this smuggling operation to get people across the border. What do we know about that side of things, and what's going to happen to this individual who was caught, Steve Shand?
So he was arrested, and he faces a few charges related to smuggling, but he's considered to be a pretty low-level player. He was just the guy driving the van. And he is likely part of a much larger network, again, that spans 3 countries to get people from India to Canada and then across the border. And the authorities in these 3 countries, have been investigating this for almost a year now. And still, he's the only person that's been arrested and charged. And I've learned from my reporting that it's very difficult to investigate and lay charges in operations like this, because these networks are made up of a lot of people across 3 different countries. And a lot of times they are connected, Sometimes they're extended family members of the people who are being smuggled across the border. Sometimes they're neighbors. And so, if you are trying to get your family member from this village in India, to the U.S., and something happens, your family member is apprehended at the border, or in this, very extreme example, they die attempting to cross it. Maybe those people that you have helped put them in touch with, who, they're smugglers, are people that are known to you.
We'll be right back. The Patel story makes me wonder, Dakshana, we've talked a little bit about this, but I guess I really kind of want to get to the heart of it here. How difficult or easy is it to legally immigrate to Canada today?
It's a lot easier than it used to be. And the federal government, so the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau, since they came into power in 2015, they have reduced a lot of the obstacles that immigrants used to face to get them here. And that has been a priority because we are facing a huge labor shortage right across the country. And also, we've had a declining birth rate in Canada since 2009. And one big change has actually been giving the provinces more power to recruit immigrants directly. And, that's been happening since the late 90s through what's called the Provincial Nominee Program. So each province can, look at what their local labor needs are and work with employers to make it easier to bring immigrants here, to set them up with work. And they have this sort of point system where if you are applying to immigrate to Canada through one of these provinces, you get assigned a certain number of points. If you meet a sort of minimum threshold, you get in. And I spoke to this one recent immigrant to Saskatchewan, Akash Patel.
And we should say no relation to the Patel family we were talking about earlier.
No relation to the Patel family, no. And he's 30 years old, which means that he is in this age category that is like the most coveted. He's young. He's a recent-ish graduate. He's got a master's degree, and he's ready to work. And he came to Saskatchewan, to Swift Current, Saskatchewan, which is not a very large town, a town of slightly more than 60,000 people. And he has been there since March. And it's probably not a place he would have considered, but he had a sister who was living there, a brother-in-law, and, they moved there a couple of years earlier. They had a 2-bedroom apartment that he could move into. And so this is a place that, he hopes to stay in long term. I think we have this old idea of immigrants always wanting to go to the same places, but we've also seen a pretty big shift in where immigrants are landing. Again, traditionally it had been destination Toronto, destination Montreal, destination Vancouver, and the sort of the surrounding areas. But those cities have gotten really expensive. And we have seen huge increase in the number of immigrants that were moving to the Kitchener-Waterloo region in Ontario. A big increase for ones that are settling in Ottawa-Gatineau. And probably the most dramatic change we've seen is in Atlantic Canada. Since 2006, the number of immigrants who have settled there has tripled.
What support does the government give to people when they're approved to immigrate here?
So there are settlement agencies across the country who get funding from the federal government, from the provincial government, and other sources. But we haven't seen the support for them keep pace with the dramatic increase in how many immigrants are arriving here. So when the Trudeau government was elected, they sort of set this benchmark of at least 300,000 immigrants would be admitted to Canada every year. And we have seen them way surpass that. I mean, by 2023, their target will be for almost 450,000 immigrants. But, I spoke to someone at ISANS, which is the Immigrant Services Association of Nova Scotia. And she was telling me about how, they struggle with worker retention in the settlement sector. They struggle with, reliable funding. With ISANS, for example, the province of Nova Scotia, from 2018 to 2021, the number of permanent residents coming to Nova Scotia increased by 51%, but ISANS's budget only increased by 7%. Mm-hmm. So you're just forced to do more with less.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that sounds like that could present an issue of people not getting the support, essentially, that they might have before. Just before I let you go here, Dakshana, you've done a lot of reporting on this issue. I guess, is there something that you've learned about the immigration process through your work that maybe most Canadians don't know?
I think one of the sort of most surprising and actually entertaining things I've learned is just how well YouTube has been used to educate people before they begin their immigration journey.
YouTube.
on all these different parts of Canada that, I guess wouldn't have been on the radar of immigrants otherwise. If you go to YouTube right now, you can enter in the name of almost any city in Canada and then immigration afterwards. So try this. Try this with Brandon and immigration. Try, Brandon, Manitoba and immigration. You can try this with St. John, New Brunswick and immigration. You can try this with Lethbridge, Alberta and immigration. And you will find a YouTube video that was uploaded by a recent immigrant explaining, what the town looks like or what the city looks like. They'll explain the steps that you need to go through to apply through the provincial nominee program. These recent immigrants are doing a lot of the heavy lifting of recruitment through these videos, and they're trying to help others who are about to make that same journey that they did. Navigate the travel a little bit easier, navigate the application process easier, and then also, sell to them this place that is maybe not on their radar yet, but has proven to be a good new home.
That's fascinating. I had no idea. Dakshana, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Rachel Levy-McLaughlin. David Crosby edits the show. Kasia Mihailovich is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.